afternoon, many of whom I have the pleasure to know. I'd like nothing more than to be able to sit with all of you for many hours to learn a little bit about your careers and the contributions you have made and continue to make in education. What I'd like to start off with speaking a little briefly about what an independent school is, and then do a brief introduction and then get into our questions. Independent schools are obviously separate from public schools because the major difference is that we're not publicly funded by the government. We are mission-based schools that our philosophy and mission drives what our institutions are about. Some schools have a focus on very progressive education. Others have provide differentiated instruction for students who are highly gifted or who have different learning styles who don't thrive in traditional school settings. We are governed by a board of trustees, so we run like a nonprofit, and our administration sits within the institution. And so the proximity that our head of school division heads, director of communications, and enrollment are all connected to the life of the institution. I'm sure our distinguished panelists can speak more about what makes an independent school as we go into our questions. But I'd like to go ahead and start with introductions of the panelists. Our first panelist is Alana Bell, who is the Director of Equity and Inclusion at Seattle Academy, which is a middle high school in Seattle, Washington. She also, in her tenure as an educator, has been a trustee, a member of the Board of Trustees, a classroom teacher, and a parent of a current student in an independent school. And she herself is a product of an independent school education. Our second panelist is Orpheus Crutchfield, who is the president of Strategenius, which is a placement firm that works with placing educators of color in independent schools around the nation. In his tenure, he's also served as faculty, a member of the Board of Trustees, and a parent of a student in independent schools. We have Ray Wilson, who is the head of the upper school at the Bush School in Seattle, Washington, which is a K through 12th grade school. He also has served in many capacities as a classroom teacher and parent of a current student in independent schools. We have Dori King, who is the Director of Community Partnerships at the Oregon Episcopal School in Portland, Oregon, which is a K through 12th grade school. In her tenure, she served as a classroom teacher and a parent of a student in independent school, and she brings a unique perspective of having also taught and worked in public school. Next, we have Cathy ONeill, who is the Director of Enrollment Management at University Prep, which is a 6th through 12th grade school in Seattle, Washington. In her tenure, she has also served as a member of the Board of Trustees, a classroom teacher, a parent, and she herself is also a product of an independent school education. And last but not least, we have Ms. Brenda Leaks, who is the head of school at the Seattle Girls School, which is a 5th through 8th grade independent all-girls school in Seattle, Washington. I want to thank you all for joining me today. So what I'd like to do is start off with a question to Dori King. Since you have, you're unique in the perspective that you've worked at both public and private schools, and in the current role that you have, you engage in private-public school partnerships. So can you speak a little bit to the ways in which public and private schools intersect, how they're similar and how they're different?
Absolutely. So the interesting piece about education is that we're always seeking to offer students the best climate and the best environment for them to learn. And I believe that we do that sometimes as independent schools, and sometimes public schools offer an environment that is the best for a student. So in our partnership work that we do with our local public school district, we support students who are English language learners by having our upper school students tutor middle school students in English language.
Much more broad question, which I'm hoping each of you can speak to. Why did you choose independent schools, and what keeps you here at independent schools?
Well, I'll dive into that question. For me, I've been in independent schools now for well over 20 years. I'm a product of independent schools as well. The thing I love about independent schools is that they usually provide a really close-knit community where you really get to know your colleagues. I've been very fortunate as a female person of color, you know, a female woman of color in independent schools to work for 2 female heads. But having had the pleasure of working for female heads who were very supportive of my own professional development and leadership is kind of why I stayed in independent schools initially. both the sense of community, but then the opportunity to really, experience all kinds of different professional developments. I think in my current role as Director of Enrollment Management, what keeps me there is having a seat at the table where I can really impact students who look like me and look like us, advocating for those students, because in reality, independent schools weren't they weren't designed for us. And that has probably been the most meaningful work. It's why I stay in the position that I'm in. So many times.
We need you, Cathy.
Thank you.
This is Dori. I'm going to jump in for a minute and kind of piggyback on what Cathy is saying. One of the things that I found in my transition from public schools to independent schools, and one of the huge differences is this sense of community that comes from being smaller than a school district. And additionally, there's a whole lot of resources that independent schools have, both from a people standpoint and a financial standpoint, that can be based on the mission of the school, that can be used for public education as well, and equity in education for all. So that was the thing that really enticed me into this world of independent schools, along with, as a classroom teacher, being given a lot of agency and independence in planning program and a lot of creativity. And that has continued with the work that we do with public educators.
And I'll just add in that for me, my sort of orientation into independent schools was not by design, it was more by happenstance. I started working in independent schools back in 1992, right out of college, and from the beginning thought about, seriously, what am I doing? I know that I can make a difference in the public schools, but yet the independent school opportunity, coming out of college, first time having a job, it was more out of opportunity than a deliberate move. But over time, I've realized that I can make a difference in both the independent school with the kids that attend, primarily students of color, as well as leveraging the resources at the school to make a difference in partnership with the local school districts. And so it's important for me, as I continue on at this day and age, to really think critically about the schools where I work. My kids have all attended an independent school and have graduated, but it's not a place where I would say for people coming into the schools to think about, wow, it's an escape. It's more, there's a sense of purpose that you should have if you are going to teach in an independent school, and you'll be surrounded by like-minded folks of color as well.
I certainly agree with having a particular purpose about being in an independent school. And as being a product of an independent school, I'm very much believing in independent schools and seeing how they've changed over the years. I've been working in independent school for 7 years, and I would say that for me, a huge part of why I do what I do is to be the representation for kids who otherwise would never know what a Black woman is intimately. I have many students who can select by the way that their lifestyle is not to know a Black person and to only know a Black person based on the way the media portrays them. So in my work, it is really important to build intimate relationships with students and with families to begin to break down some of those stereotypes and barriers because of the fact that a lot of my families don't know intimately any Black people, and they could actually for the rest of their life never, depending on how they choose to live their life. So it's important for me. It's a lot of work sometimes, but it's something that I will gladly do every single day to make sure that what is seen on television is not the limited view that represents all women of color.
Yeah. I want to follow up on that. I remember the exact moment that I decided I was going to work in an independent school. I was actually working for a small nonprofit that supported students who were first-generation college students, go from kind of like our Rainier Prep, but it was on the East Coast, and helping them to connect with independent schools. And I was recruiting independent school high schoolers to participate in the summer program. And I was getting a tour at a school in Philadelphia. And I remember walking down the hall and seeing this Black girl sitting on the floor surrounded by probably, you know, white classmates and friends of hers who had their hands in her hair. And I remember the look on her face when she saw me walk by, like, you know, are you going to help me? Like, because she probably didn't have the words herself to be able to convey to them why that would be an issue when that's a way that they were showing care. The way that they, you know, that kind of community grooming that happens when you play in someone's hair. And I had only been there looking to think about the students I was going to recruit. And in that moment, I looked up and I looked around and I realized that there were not many adults of color in those communities. And so I spent another year at that program that I was at, and then I jumped into independent school teaching. And not only did I then become aware that I was going to be a role model and an advocate, you know, as Cathy said, for those students who looked like me, but I realized for many of the students who didn't look like me, I would be one of the only non-white teachers that they had in their entire school career. And I have stayed in independent schools because of the fact that I feel like, as you've heard others say, that sense of community, the opportunities, the invitation to be at the table. As a person who has recently made the move from being a senior administrator to being the most senior administrator as a head of school in the community, I will say a large part of my decision to become a head of school, because I had a very comfortable job that I could fit in a box and, like, you know, do all this other thing to make my life really, you know, complete, and personally passion, all that stuff. And I took this additional step in part because I felt that drive to be a model for both kids who look like me, adults who look like me, and for those who didn't. And I think that there's a real opportunity for educators of color to be that role model for the next Bill Gates and senator, congressman, congresswoman, right? So that's part of why I came and why I'm still here.
I also recall when I got started in the independent schools, I was initially actually a public school educator. I was teaching special ed kindergarten, something a lot of people don't know, actually. And then I went on, though, to an independent school in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was shocked to find out that I was apparently the first African-American male to ever teach at this school. And this was about 1990. I couldn't believe it. And so I went in knowing that I could remain in the public schools, but I thought I would check this out. And as many people have said, found out that not only could I make a difference for, of course, the students of color, the few students of color at the time, but also for the white students who really had not, at least at the first grade, they had no relationship with any person of color in any significant way daily. And so I'm going to take a different angle on this and say that what I found is that it was really going to take an element of trailblazing to go into these institutions and make change happen. And what I'm interested in, and many people in our schools, all the administrators on this panel, we're all interested in finding people who can see the power of bringing the whole you. We really need the best educators in the country to impact both sectors, both public and independent schools.
Amen to that.
Say, I hear you, Orpheus, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, because many of the things that are done in independent schools can be done in public schools. Absolutely. And it's just a matter of exposure and sharing.
I mean, for me, I think just reflecting on as I'm hearing you all talk, I'm so inspired because I remembered as to why I came into independent schools. And part of that was that sense of agency, because independent schools provided for me as a classroom practitioner the ability and the bandwidth to really develop my craft, and also the agency to be able to do social justice work in the classroom in a way that I was not able to do in public education. And I think that's the reason why I've stayed. And I think Cathy made mention of this around the ability to be able to make a headway. And Ray talked about the leverage that you're able to use, you know, leveraging your position to really push um, equity and inclusion in your institutions. And you have a community that's driven around a mission, so you know how to work with that. So it's really empowering. I think the possibility allows for educators of color as empowerment to be able to, as Orpheus said, be trailblazers in the work that they do. I wanted to kind of just delve into a little bit. I wanted to ask Ray, and any other educator can also chime in. As a director of the upper school, as a head of upper school, you work with faculty and faculty support. What does onboarding for educators who come into your school, or educators who are entering independent school for the first time, what does some of that onboarding look like at your school?
So for us, I meet with the faculty one-on-one at the beginning of their tenure at the school to talk about what their hopes and dreams are, not only for this first year, but 3 to 5 years down the road. Not only professionally, their work in the classroom, but personally. We're a school that we have a pretty robust professional development budget. So I want to make sure that the faculty coming in have an opportunity to actualize their dreams and passions through the use of professional development funds. And at the same time, we talk about their interpersonal work. So if they are standing in the classroom and they have a diverse group of students in the room, how are they preparing themselves for that particular interchange? And the other piece to that is, to be, in my opinion, an effective educator, you have to have versatility, interacting with students from different backgrounds, interacting with colleagues from different backgrounds. So there has to be that ongoing interpersonal work to deepen their understanding and awareness of others. So we have those types of conversations, not only at the beginning, but throughout the year. And then it's tied to evaluations. So what are you doing to strengthen your set of tools that you will need on a daily basis in and out of the classroom? So it's more of an overall game plan for the faculty member, more so than just how are you doing teaching math or English. There's more complexity to being an educator in an independent school.
I would just add that additionally at University Prep, we have faculty and staff actually are matched up with a mentor. So that might be someone, and they usually have two, right? So they'll have one that is very much so in an experienced educator in their department, but they'll also have someone that's outside of their department that will help them kind of navigate the independent school world. Because I think in talking with certainly people of color, but any new folks who have never worked in independent schools, I had a colleague that came. She was a counselor in large middle school and high schools in Vegas, and she came to University Prep to work there. And I think the first year she was like, "This is like a Twilight Zone almost." It was such an adjustment. She said, "These people seem so happy, and like everything, like these people don't seem like they have any problems." And I said, "Oh, just wait, there's problems everywhere. These are just typical kids." But it took a long time for her, even as a white person, to adjust to independent school culture and norms. And so I think it's really helpful. I think faculty and staff have found it really helpful to have that mentor to ask sometimes questions that those of us who have been in independent schools for quite some time kind of take for granted.
So, I used to work with Montauk at the Overlake School, so I was deeply connected to the work that we did there. And as Ray said, there was most schools do an onboarding series of days where you learn about not only the nuts and bolts about your schedule and teaching and how to fill out forms and how to connect to the internet, but also about the culture of the school, about the values of the school, and about how to, live in community with the people so that you're upholding the mission in a way that the school would hope that you would. And the goal there is also to make sure that you're successful. And so, I remember we went through this series where we tried at Overlake to actually say, what would a cultural pitfall be? For example, at Overlake, kids and teachers, they call each other by first name. There's a level of mutual respect there. So how you might see that and fall into a pitfall would be if you're the teacher who comes in and wants everybody to call you by their last name, or if you go into the cafeteria and you cut line. Like, maybe in previous schools you could cut line in front of kids as a teacher, but not at this school. Don't get yourself in trouble. So we try to really be that specific of giving examples of how the culture comes to life, so that was really real. We also had an instructional coach who worked with teachers in their first year to do that same cultural thing in the classroom. And so what does rigor mean? How do you pinpoint the exact level of homework that you should give, so that not based on your understanding from your own experience, but based on your understanding and how it intersects with the culture that you are now in. So, you know, there's a lot of good work happening to make sure that new faculty members are successful in the schools, the independent schools. There's a lot of work put into that, a lot of thought put into that. And so new teachers can be assured that they'll have that support.
And I think with one of the things we think about with new teachers is that a lot of it is adjusting to kind of getting a sense of how independent schools work and how a mission-based school works. But I think the goal of a school that's truly seeking to be equitable and inclusive, that the goal is to integrate that educator of color, not that they come to fit into the mold of what independent school is, but a school that's really intentional around equity inclusion, is really thinking around integration, around we have an aversion to the word fit when we think about candidates of color, because we think we'll fit to what. So we're mindful around our own biases, or at least strive to be, in our hiring and thinking about how we want to really embrace and cultivate diversity from a place of intention. My next question is for Orpheus. As you are the president of Strategenius and you work with placement of educators of color, what trends and patterns do you see for educators of color in leadership roles within independent schools and the schools you work with across the nation?
The future really holds a lot of positivity in terms of opportunity, particularly for women and for candidates of color, because all of education, I think, is recognizing, but particularly independent schools, really starting to recognize the fact of the power, again, of diversity and inclusion in particular, and also, of course, equity. And so there were data that showed, you know, there was going to be these big retirements of our top leadership in our schools, and because of, you know, historic happenings, it turned out to be a little bit bigger than a trickle rather than the big retirements. But what's happening is that it seems to be increasing and accelerating, and that means that there will be openings and there will be opportunities at the head of school level, as Brenda is a head of school. But what happens is when people move up, get more, you know, hopefully get more women and people of color in headships, then there's a cascading of opportunity that happens. And so if someone comes in as a faculty member, as a teacher, if she's shown leadership and getting involved in the community and really becoming a master of her craft, people will be tapped to get into the other positions that lead up to maybe department chair, and then perhaps lead into a deanship, and on up until headship, if that's what someone wants. Because the other thing that independent schools really value are master teachers. And you know, with what Ray was saying and what Brenda was talking about in terms of professional development, we want people to love their craft, to be supported in developing their craft, and to be sharing that both with not just the students, but also with your peers, your other faculty member. And just lastly, the independent schools are a small but at the same time large community of educators where we create opportunities for people to share what they love and their expertise. So we have conferences in the Pacific Northwest, we have conferences nationally where people can demonstrate what they've learned, and it's really an opportunity to shine and really, you know, to spread your expertise. So opportunities, we feel they're going to be abounding in the very near future. So we encourage you to check this out.
One of the things I would just add to is I think particularly in our area in the Pacific Northwest, we're a very collegial group of independent schools. And so I think for me, one of the most valuable things I did early on, once I became one of a few African-American admission directors in the area, is I contacted the other 3 at the time. And I said, hello, this is who I am. I'm new to this role. I know there's going to be a lot of, stuff I just don't know. And I need to be able to call you up and ask you those questions that I don't feel comfortable asking around the big table. And I literally took them out to lunch. And from that was born the Independent School Fair for Families of Color. Started literally from that lunch. It was an idea that we brought up, and it's now its 11th year. And one thing that sustains me working in independent schools are my colleagues that I have at other schools. I think there's a genuine care and concern that we have for one another, so that at many of our schools, right, there's a very limited number of other people of color at our individual schools. But the power that we have of getting together and collaborating together is really, that for me is very sustaining. When there are times when I want to get out of my own school, and to be able to connect with people of color from other independent schools, I think our area in particular is very strong in that regard.
I was going to ask Alana this question. We talked about this, and anyone else who wants to chime in, we've talked a little bit about this, but I'm curious with Alana and also Cathy, because you've had so many roles, both of you are also products of an independent school education. If there's any other aspects of some of the roles you've been in that you can speak to, the culture of independent schools, your work and your craft as teachers, that can give a lens to people who are considering becoming educators in our schools. What can you tell us a little bit about it, about some role or some aspect?
Yeah. Well, for me, I always tell people I am fortunate enough to work at the independent school that I graduated from. And I always tell people that the best decision my parents made was sending me here, and the best decision I ever made was coming back to work here. And so I am a firm believer in independent schools. I've been in independent schools since I was in the first grade. Well, I should actually say first in parochial school, and then transitioning into the independent school that my daughter attends and that I sit on the board of. And I think for me, having had various roles as a student, as an active alum, as an educator, as an administrator, I've really been able to have a true understanding of what a school means to be really firmly embedded in their mission, and how as 20 years can go by, which is almost has for me here at Seattle Academy, I can still see that commitment to the mission, and that part of that is the ability to not have to deal with certain types of bureaucracy that you may have to deal with in public school settings, and the ability to really create and innovate without barriers that oftentimes you could face in the public school system. So that's one piece of it. I think my personal piece that I really most identify with was being the only brown kid in my class for middle school, for 7th and 8th grade, and having come from a school where my best friend was the other black girl in my class. And never feeling, oddly enough, like I was the only one. There were moments, obviously, that I could see that and recognize it, but never having really felt ostracized, and always really felt supported by my community because of who I was, because of who my family was. And I can recall when my first week of work coming back to the school looked very, very different. There were lots of brown kids and lots of black girls that I never had that opportunity to have. And I can recall our admission director, who admitted me, who was still here at the school, said, we didn't have a fancy diversity initiative in 1997 when you got here, but we were committed to making sure you weren't alone. And hearing that is what really triggered me to have a true understanding of what education really is about, and supporting kids and supporting families. And really that small little conversation we had, has probably been one of the most impactful things in my work as an educator, thinking about what access means for all families, because I am now in a position where I might not make a ton of money, but I'm very much privileged because I know this system. I'm very much privileged because I am an educator, so I can be asked to be on a board and I know this information. So now I move forward thinking about the families who at the time, you know, my family was one of those families, and really being able to continue to do that work. And so again, it definitely, the landscape in my mind in some ways has changed of what an independent school looks like, but there are still a lot of the same challenges that we face. And I would say that the biggest challenge is, at least for me personally in my work, is making sure that when families who come from whatever type of group, marginalized group they may come from, any type of family, that we are providing them with access to the system, and that they feel ownership in their community, and that they know that this is their home. So that's something that is really embedded in my work. But I really feel like I had a great experience. It wasn't always easy, but I don't think that adolescence is or should be. And I would lastly say that my experience and all of the roles that I've played, you know, has really allowed me to be in these different spaces, but really be true to who I am and true to my experience. And I think that's why I've been able to move pretty fluidly through all of these spaces that I've held in independent education.
The only thing I would add, and I'm going to give the total parent perspective on this, because I think Alana covered the kind of being the person that's the professional in independent schools. My daughter's a senior in college and I'm getting ready to graduate in May, yay. But I have 3 children, and 3 very different children. My middle daughter has special needs, so she's been in the public school. She's currently in the transition program there. I have a younger son. Hold on, sister. Sorry, she's actually at home right now. No, sister. Yes, sorry. And then I have my younger son who is 15 and a sophomore, and he's at a charter school in the International District in Seattle. And so my oldest daughter went to Catholic school. She went to public school. So as a parent, I've seen their experiences. And for my daughter who went to both public school and Catholic school, I think the biggest difference that I saw in her experience with independent school is the amount of opportunity she had at independent schools. So the ability, you know, for her to go with a class and sleep outdoors. And I think that this also certainly relates to teaching as well, because teachers have these opportunities as well. Matav, you were talking about, you know, right now you're able to do this kind of class out in the community, right? Where you're able to explore something that you're very interested in. And teachers have that opportunity. It's not just the ability to coach, but we have teachers right now that are in Nepal or in India or in Botswana. We have teachers who, you know, might be teaching a bookmaking class because that's something that they're really interested in addition to math. And our students have that opportunity. My daughter got to do things that, quite frankly, my son can't do in the public school. I mean, that my daughter wasn't able to do in public school, that my daughter who went to Catholic school, the resources weren't there that are available to her. The small class sizes, I think I can't speak enough about, you know, there are wonderful teachers in public schools. And man, they have to do so much work because they have so many kids oftentimes in a class, right? Where our teachers have the benefit of having small classes. So they have the time and the small class size to allow them to get to know their students on a more personal level. So not just in their classes, my daughter had her, you know, her advisor was also her soccer coach, who was also her outdoor ed. She's the person, I wasn't taking her to go sleep on the ground because I don't camp like that. But you do that in school, you know? And that to me was one of the greatest value adds, because my daughter got to interact with students who otherwise she may not have interacted with, but it was on something that she had an interest in, you know, going outdoors and hiking. She got to meet students that she wouldn't otherwise have done. And she wasn't going to get that experience from me. She got to go, you know, to Nepal. Not going to get that experience from me. And these are students for whom I think all of our schools try to ensure that all of these opportunities that our schools provide, they're accessible to all students. So not just students who can afford them. Oftentimes our financial aid packages cover all of the extras. And that's oftentimes something that, you know, middle income families or families who are not don't understand independent schools. They don't understand all of the opportunities. So the amount of opportunities available for students and teachers in independent schools to explore their interests and to get to know their students, I think is really exceptional.
I would just add to what Cathy said. Cathy and I were on a panel not too long ago, and we were fortunate enough to talk to some young girls of color who were kind of asking us, you know, well, is it worth staying? Because it can be hard to be in a space where, you know, you don't see a ton of your reflection in your peers potentially. And the panel was all women who have been in independent schools, have children in independent schools, have either, you know, did a little bit of public school and then were in independent schools, or ultimately left independent school for public. And all of us in this panel agreed, stay. It is worth it. And it's exactly what Cathy said, that the opportunities that are available to students in independent schools are worth it. And that's why I think there is such a great weight and responsibility on us as educators, especially educators of color, to create that space for students, to be that, you know, support for them so that they can get through and get these opportunities. And ultimately, hopefully, they'll be the kids who can make a shift in what education looks like in the future.
Yeah, I want to just give even more context to what Cathy was saying earlier around class size, because as we all know, there are some fantastic teachers in public schools, but they're given an almost impossible task. So, as an example, I've worked with people both in public and independent schools, and I recall one candidate in particular from public schools who was a history teacher, and this person in public school had 7 classes of about 32 kids, so it came out to be about 224 students to need to do to be reading reports, doing grades for reports, 224. Then I've had history teachers in independent schools, and generally schools will have something like 4 to 5 sections and somewhere around 15 to 18 students. So on the high end, we're talking maybe 90. So 224, 90. It's obvious that it's more handleable. You get to know your students in a much deeper way. It's the physics of it, you know. So I just wanted to put some context around what are we talking about when we say smaller class sizes exactly.
And I would just add, many schools offer, you know, in addition to the ongoing professional development, I can't say enough about that for teachers. At University Prep, we've got, you know, summer paid planning time. So, you know, teachers who want to collaborate and maybe come up with a new course or, you know, examine something. I mean, the opportunities to be creative and, again, to continue to master your craft, I think are really so supported in independent schools as well.
Level of excellence, which is exciting to witness for students and also as educators, because as Alana said, you get to be a co-creator in that next generation for that innovation and that flourishing of those young minds. I have 2 more questions for the panel. I'll start with the first one, and then our time will unfortunately have to end. But why would you advise educators of color to advance their careers in independent schools? What is one piece of advice that you'd give as to why they should?
I would say one piece of advice is, as your sense of purpose becomes clear, the longer you work in independent schools, you realize that you need to be able to make decisions around resources or know how to communicate with those decision makers to get them to make decisions that are in the best interest for the students. And I think the longer you're in the schools, you begin to become more aware of the nuances of working in an independent school, because everything that we've talked about so far is really important. But then there's the nuances, things that we can't even tell you because you have to experience it firsthand. And the idea is for you to be fully prepared to navigate the world of being a person of color in an independent school. And the other piece I would say is that oftentimes families of color talk about independent schools in terms of, if my kid graduates, they'll have, you know, a wealth of opportunities after they leave the school. But I would say it's important to think about creating moments of instant gratification for students of color. So my thing is, as you advance or think about advancing in the schools, think about the day-to-day opportunities to make a difference for students.
I would follow that, and this may seem like a really simple answer, but you should think about advancing yourself because you can. And you know, the reality is, for as far as society has come in terms of the opportunities that are available to women and people of color, there are still a lot of ceilings and a lot of doors that are closed. And this is an area, this is a realm where the voice, perspective of people of color and women is highly valued, because you can. And I think, you know, sometimes we don't think about ourselves taking that opportunity because we don't have a lot of models. And you just have to sometimes step out there, taking a risk, not knowing how it's going to work out. And this is a great realm to do that.
With my last question, and then we'll end with this, unless there's any final thoughts and comments any of you would like to make. How does equity and inclusion live in your schools?
Oh gosh, I think it's really interesting. I have this conversation often. I think that, you know, there's always been buzzwords around this work, whatever you would like to call it. And the work diversity, just that being the director of diversity, that never really appealed to me because I just thought it was so broad, and what does that mean? And I think that while equity and inclusion can sometimes sound like a buzzword just because it's everywhere, I believe wholeheartedly that that's the right way to frame this work, because if we look at what equity means here in our school, equity means everyone gets what they need to be successful within the system, not what is fair, not what is equal, but what they need to be successful. And I think that that's really important to make sure that that's defined really clearly by each institution. And so for me, you know, I am the director of equity and inclusion, and I always tell people I have the title, but this is all of our jobs. This is something that cannot be done by one person. It's impossible, and it's impossible for this work to ever be done or finished. I think, you know, when we get to a place where we are not dealing with the kind of socioeconomic kind of disparity that we're dealing with within independent schools, I think we might be a little bit closer, but there's always going to be challenges in regard to making sure that all families, all kids can be successful within the system. And so I think there has to be someone who, yes, is leading that work, but it has to really be embedded within the community and within the values and the mission of the school. And I think at my school, I think there's a lot of work for us still to do. And my job, a lot of that right now, is building structures to facilitate making sure that there is access. You know, a lot of times things are built on relationships where you know a kid, so you know what their situation may be at home. But the reality is, we can create structures where we know this information going in before we have to even build that relationship to find out what a kid's situation may be. So that's really what I've been focusing on a lot this year, and will be focusing on into the next. But also, I think there's a board piece. If your board is not committed to this work, that is going to be problematic. So I think making sure that your board is committed, if they have set some type of markers for your school, I think that's very important, because we can do all the work that we do, but there is something to be said for numbers and what that means. And are you actually walking, you know, the walk, and are you doing enough outside of your community to make sure that your school reflects the world that our kids are going to go off into? So that's kind of a small portion of kind of what our work looks like. I think I think Cathy and many others have said there's so much space for continuing to develop our educators in regards to this work, and making sure that their classrooms are reflective of the students and their students' experiences. So that's really important too.
I feel like equity and inclusion happens every single day, hundreds of times, throughout the day on so many occasions, every day in our schools. And I think the thing that I think I'm most proud of is that I don't think that we'll ever be to a place where we'll tick off that that's where we've checked off that we're good. You know, we're good. We're all, with regard to equity and inclusion, I think in our lifetimes at least, it will always be a work in progress. And I think our school certainly looks at it like that. I think we've tended to lean into the messy conversations because it's easy. You know, it's easy to get a very diverse group of students and families together. The work is making those folks feel like they have a valued voice around the table, right? And that's where, you know, people bump into each other, and that's where the mess happens. And oftentimes, you know, that's the work we don't really want to do, because especially in our area, we like to be nice, and, you know, we like to always assume good intention. And so we lean into the discomfort of having difficult conversations with students. We try and train our students to facilitate those conversations. And it was interesting to me that I had assumed that in a public school that, especially a diverse public school, that they would be having a lot more conversations around equity and inclusion. And quite frankly, I was surprised that oftentimes in public schools, they have the numbers, but they're not doing the explicit work around equity and inclusion. That's all they have is the numbers. And a lot of the things that need to be happening with regard to professional development for educators, with regard to those difficult conversations, with regard to putting resources at equity and inclusion aren't happening in public schools. They do have the people, and I think they also have a lot of good intentions, but oftentimes I was surprised that it wasn't happening, that oftentimes, and I think that we can also as independent schools fall into, if you look at what public schools are doing, fall into the mistake of assuming that, oh, well, we're good, we're good, you know, but in reality, it's ongoing work, and we haven't arrived. And I don't think that I'll ever, you know, I would ever get to a point where I said, yeah, I'm at this school, man, we're done with equity and inclusion. It's hard, messy work. And I think that our schools are committed. For most of our schools, right, it's a part of our mission. That's who we are. And so we invest a lot of time, resources, effort, energy on a day-to-day basis. I know equity and inclusion in the admin team meetings comes up every single admin team meeting, whether we're talking about equity and inclusion around, you know, access to programs or transportation to school. In every decision, we're always thinking about, is this equitable to all students?
I think part of the reason why this work, as Cathy said, it kind of, you know, it's ongoing, and it will be, is because part of the joy and the challenge of schools is that we flip our entire population every, so, you know, whatever the number of years is, depending on how many years your school goes through. And so just when you feel like you're at the point where you can hold something firmly, you have a whole new population of families and students and perspectives to bring, that you have to then bring along. And so it is this kind of urgent and vital and also never ending work. And I agree with everything that's been said about how it has to come from the bottom up and the top down, and that it's about a lot of really small conversations. And, you know, they're conversations that span, you know, interactions on a big level. Right, we had a really interesting conversation here at Seattle Girls School the other day about the N-word as it comes up in literature and how we address that. And then, you know, the smaller side of that might be a teacher who I overheard in the hallway jumping into a group of students, where one student who was from a younger grade kind of barreled into the group and gave a student in the group a hug. And the teacher stepped into that space and said, "Do you even know her name? Did you have any conversation with her about getting into her personal space?" Right? Just like having that sense of awareness of your needs and other people's needs and how they balance. That's all part of this work, and it happens in big ways and small ways across all of our schools.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you for being as incredible as you are in your prospective schools, and for taking the time to address some questions. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Matak, for facilitating and moderating.
Yes, thank you.
Yes,
Thank you. Yeah, it's an honor.
Pleasure.
Every chance to be with this group of distinguished educators is I'd jump at the chance. So thank you for that honor. So.
I guess one last thing I would say, if you're out there as a potential teacher listening to this, thinking about exploring an opportunity of teaching in an independent school, come and visit us. You can reach out to any of us on this panel at our schools and say, can I come take a tour? Can I come see what it's like? Sit in a classroom, engage, think about it, and expand kind of, what you thought your horizon was. And we'd love to engage with you. So give us a try.
Thank you, Brenda. And with that, we'll say goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.